Indeed, I am. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I can't believe we've done 6 or 7 of these already. That's awesome. There's still plenty of Roosevelt story to talk about. So if you're enjoying these, let the folks there know, and maybe they'll have me back. So tonight we are talking about FDR and his leadership during World War II. And
Oh,
FDR, of course, was a war president and got us through the Second World War. But before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that Veterans Day is coming up later this week. And if you are a veteran and you are watching, I thank you very sincerely for your service. We couldn't be doing what we're doing if it hadn't been for the stuff that you guys had done. So, freedom is not free, and we owe you guys and gals a great debt of gratitude for keeping us free and keeping us safe. So thank you for that. So before we talk about FDR and World War II, let's first talk a little bit about World War II. Because in order to understand his leadership through the Second World War, we have to understand what a war this was. This was a huge and incredible, undertaking. It was truly a world war. Most of the countries on the planet were involved in this war to one degree or the other. It was truly a global war. The sun never set on World War II. Once it got started, it was always being fought someplace on the planet. And it was truly a total war. Every man, woman, and child that was in these countries involved with this war were involved with the war, whether they were in uniform, whether they were on the home front, whether they were, being involved in scrap drives and materiel drives and those sorts of things. It truly was a total war. And it lasted 6 years. 2,194 days. It started on September 1st, 1939, and it ended with the ceremony, the Japanese surrendering on September 2nd, 1945. And although the war lasted 6 years, the surrender ceremony lasted just 18 minutes. So, it was just really just wrapped up, in that simple but very solemn and very important ceremony. 60 million people were killed during the war, it's estimated. So that's 10 million people a year. And if you add the multiplier effect to that, the number of families, let's say, who were involved with the war that had lost somebody, then that 60 million certainly becomes a much larger number quite quickly. 16 million Americans served in the war. That would be 2 times the number of every person in New York City. So if you can imagine New York City, now multiply that by 2, and that's the number of folks that we had that participated in the war. 416 thousand American service personnel died during the war. That comes out to 69,333 per year, 5,777 per month on average, 189 per day, 8 per hour. So by the time we finish this talk tonight, the first, that 8 would have already had passed away just in the time that we're going to talk. The cost of the war, about $4 billion. $2 billion alone was for the Manhattan Project. And the after effects of that war are still being fought. The war was fought with a huge undertone of racial prejudice and ethnic prejudice, along with a lust for power and a lust for world domination on the part of the Nazis. And they were out to destroy anybody who didn't fit their idea of what the superior Aryan was supposed to be, the master race. And I always find it so ironic that Hitler and the top Nazis, if you look at them, would not pass their own litmus test in terms of being, the ideal Aryan. The war, of course, also culminated in the Holocaust, the targeted destruction of European Jews. So it was, a tragedy on that level as well. And it was fought with no guarantee that we would win. We look back now on World War II, and of course, the good guys won, and the Allies, and we defeated Hitler and such. But at the time that it was being played out, there was no guarantee that that was going to happen. When the United States entered the war on December 7th, 1941, we were ranked anywhere from 14th to 17th behind Portugal in military power. And we had just had a significant portion of our Pacific Fleet destroyed by the attack at Pearl Harbor. And we racked up significant losses and defeats in 1942 and 1943. It took quite a while for the tide of the war to turn. And we entered the war with largely World War I uniforms, World War I equipment, World War I training manuals, a lack of tanks, a lack of planes. So we were really, really unprepared for this war, which was in fact, the largest conflict here on this planet. We benefited from some of the Nazis' mistakes during the war. Hitler opened the second front with Russia, which took some of the heat off the Allies over on the Western area, coming into Europe, from the west into the east. So that brought a little bit of relief to the Allied forces there, as Hitler was now forced to fight a two-front war, which was by his own doing. He also did not take a grab for the Middle East, which seemed to have been, the strategic thing to do, right? They had all the oil there in the Middle East, but instead of going that way, he went to the north of Africa and, went into northern Africa, which he held for a while, but then we were able to take that back. So World War II was a great, giant, huge, enormous deal. And we don't pay enough attention to that. We don't pay enough attention to, it was really where, humanity hung in the balance. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the guy who led us through that. Now, I'm going to be talking about Roosevelt, of course, but the work was done by millions, as we said, 16 million, men and women in uniform, hundreds of millions of more folks at home, tending victory gardens, putting up blackout shades, doing scrap drives and those sorts of things. But I'm going to talk about FDR because he was the leader and he helped to organize and provide a direction and a focus for our war effort. And really, I think it's not an overstatement to say that Franklin Roosevelt was exactly the right guy in exactly the right place at exactly the right time with exactly the right skills. Now, I may be a little bit biased, working there at the Roosevelt estate. But if you think about this, Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler came to power within about 6 weeks of each other. And they died within 6 weeks of each other. So you had good and evil on the world scale balancing each other out for almost exactly the precise same number of days, which extended out to be 12 years. Hitler was in power for 12 years. FDR was in power for 12 years. And Roosevelt ran for the third term. He was president for 2 terms, as every president generally was. And then he was expecting to retire the presidency after 2 terms. But he decided to run for the third term because he was worried about Hitler. At the end of that first 8-year period, Roosevelt's power had begun to diminish. He was getting ready to retire the presidency. But in Europe, Hitler had just solidified his power. And he was getting ready to unleash the Holocaust and unleash his drive, along with the other Axis powers, for world domination. And Roosevelt had Hitler's number as early as 1933. Roosevelt received an Americanized version of Mein Kampf. Now, Roosevelt had read Mein Kampf in German. Roosevelt was able to read German, and he had read the original version. And when he got the American version, much of the anti-Semitism had been taken out to appeal to a broader audience. But Roosevelt had read Mein Kampf. He understood what Hitler was about. He understood what Hitler was looking to do. And, he felt that it would be a bad idea to be breaking in a new president just as Hitler was beginning to solidify his power. Now, by 1939, FDR had been in power here in the United States for a little over 6 years, and he had a great number of allies in Congress. He had folks who owed him favors. He had the faith and trust of the American people because he had led us through the Great Depression. He had relationships with world leaders across the globe, and he had the experience and knowledge of how to get things done in Washington. So all of these things, the 6 years of on-the-job training and experience, was really a very important asset for him. He had also been a lifelong stamp collector. Now you might think, well, what does that have to do with being a leader during World War II? Well, it was a global war, remember? So the sun never set on World War II once it got started. And since Roosevelt had collected stamps from the time he was a child, he was very familiar with geography around the world. And so when we were fighting on these small little islands or these small little villages, either in Europe or out in the Pacific, he knew where a lot of those were, or at least generally knew where they were. And more importantly, he knew a lot about the people who lived there, because when he studied and collected stamps, he did it not for the value of the stamp, but for what the stamp reflected. So if there was an important building or an important person on a stamp from a country, he would research who that person was or what that building was, and he learned a lot about the culture of people around the world. So when it came time to fight in all these far off places, he had a head start in understanding where they were and what they were and the kinds of people that were living in those places. And then finally, he had sort of a dress rehearsal. I guess there's no other better way to put it, for being commander-in-chief during the Second World War. And that was that he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. So when we came time in the First World War to send ships and machines and supplies and material and weapons across the ocean to fight in Europe, he gained all the experience about supply routes, supply lines, bottlenecks, loading and unloading things onto ships, transporting, navigation, all these sorts of things. And this came in as invaluable experience when he found himself as commander-in-chief during the Second World War, and then needed to do this again to get the same kinds of materials to Europe, but now also into the Pacific. So he had a very quick learning curve because he already knew how to do quite a bit about that. So when I say he was really kind of the perfect guy for the job, the perfect guy to have in that spot at that time, it's for those reasons that I say that. The dress rehearsal, the experience with the government, the background in understanding places around the world, and just having had sort of Hitler's number early on and being in the right place at the right time. Now, people tend to forget that the World War started in Europe on September 1st, 1939. If you ask, the average American, well, when did World War II start? Most folks are going to say, oh, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And that's when it began for us. And it started on that Sunday morning. The United States was at peace in the world. We had adopted a policy of neutrality. Certainly our affinity and our allegiance was with England against Hitler, but there were neutrality laws that had been passed after the First World War that were designed to limit America's ability to get into a Second World War. And these laws were in place, and they were very problematic in terms of helping countries defend themselves, because we weren't allowed by law to participate or to send this material to other places. And so when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, it came as a complete surprise. Now, a lot of people say, well, come on now, didn't he use that as an excuse to get into the war? And, there's even people that would go so far as to say, conspiracy theorists, oh, he let it happen as an excuse to get into the war. And quite frankly, nothing could be farther from the truth. Pearl Harbor was in fact built to be this incredible naval and military base about a third of the way across the Pacific Ocean. And the strategy of the United States was to put this base out there, this military base. It was primarily a naval base, but there was also an army base there as well. And back in those days, there was no Air Force. So the Army was the Air Force. So they flew the planes. And the idea of this was to build up this large military base a third of the way across the Pacific to project power into the Pacific Rim. So the United States felt that it had been doing everything it could do to defend against the Japanese aggression in the Pacific area. And we were negotiating with the Japanese diplomats to try to bring the tensions down in the Pacific Rim. Now, the problem was that even the Japanese diplomats didn't know that the Japanese military was going to attack Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese diplomats were kept out of the loop. They were sent to Washington to try to negotiate, a peace deal, a lessening of tensions. And the entire time that they're doing this, the Japanese military is planning to execute this attack. And they did this to keep it even more of a surprise. In fact, one of the Japanese ambassadors wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt after the war an apology letter saying, please, Mr. Roosevelt, please understand that when we were talking to the president, we were telling him everything that, we believed to be true, that, from what our own government was telling us. And in fact, we had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. So we were able to listen in from what they were being told in Tokyo to what the diplomats were being told in Washington. So we were listening in on their instructions on, here's what you need to do, try to lessen the tensions, those sorts of things. And then they would come in and they'd say, listen, we've been instructed by our government to try to lessen the tensions and things. And this made perfect sense because we already knew it from breaking the diplomatic code. The problem was we hadn't broken the military code. Had we done that, we would have been able to listen in and find out that the Japanese military was planning the attack at Pearl Harbor. So we had this huge base out there. The idea was to project power across the Pacific Rim. And we felt it was pretty well protected. We had some radar out there. Radar was a brand new thing. Unfortunately, we didn't have it turned on all the time. We would only turn it on for certain hours during the day. The Japanese had spies. They knew when it was turned on and when it was turned off. And so they were able to take advantage of that. The technicians that were using the radar were brand new at the job. Radar was brand new. So a lot of the things they were seeing were kind of disputed when they passed it up the chain of command. The top brass had kind of convinced itself that an attack couldn't happen at Pearl Harbor. First of all, we were over 3,000 miles away from Japan, and nobody had ever attacked anybody in the history of warfare over a 3,000-mile stretch. We also believed that we had zillions of miles of ocean out there, so that if anything was coming, we'd see it well before it happened. And we also believed that because Pearl Harbor was a shallow port, that there would be no submarine operating in the port. So we felt we were safe from that perspective as well. These were all assumptions that were ultimately proven wrong. Right? The Japanese were able to attack over 3,000 miles because they had planned so well to do that. The zillions of miles of ocean didn't protect us because we were looking off in the direction of Japan, expecting the attack to come that way, when in fact they did sort of a Hail Mary. They went up toward the Aleutian Islands and came down the north. So while we're looking this way, they came in from this side over here. And there was some dispute as to who was in charge out there. Well, it's a naval base, certainly, but the Army is there too. So who's in charge? Is it the Army or the Navy? And they were never quite able to to figure that out. So there was a lot of rivalry there between the Army and the Navy, and they weren't sharing information the way they should have been. And each one wanted to be the shining star back to Washington. So all of these things led up to a terrible miscalculation on the part of the United States, and Japan took advantage of that. They attacked Pearl Harbor, and they wiped out a significant portion of our fleet. Luckily, 3 of our carriers were at sea at the time the attack took place. And the other lucky thing about the attack was that it was supposed to take place in 3 waves, but the Japanese brought only in the first 2 waves of attack, and they called off the 3rd wave. The first wave of the attack was to come through and take out the Army Air Force so that we couldn't get planes in the air to shoot down the Japanese planes that were coming in. So they came in and they wiped out the planes. That was the first wave. The second wave of the attack was to come in and wipe out the battleships in Battleship Row. And that was the main objective, to keep our ships sink them in that harbor so that they couldn't get out to sea and couldn't get out over to Japan to fight in the Pacific Rim. So that was the main objective, and that was the second wave. The third wave was supposed to come in and knock out our repair facilities and what they called our tank fields, which were huge oil tanks with oil that we used to fuel the ships. Because they left those intact, they called off the third wave. When it came time to repair our ships, our repair facilities were still in great shape, and we still had all the oil there. So when we brought those carriers back in, we could fuel them up and get them out there. The other advantage that we had was 3 days after the attack at Pearl Harbor on December 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States. That gave us the excuse then to get into the war in Europe, which is the war that Roosevelt really saw as being the biggest problem. As I said, as early as 1933, he had Hitler's number, and he kind of knew what Hitler was up to, that he couldn't be trusted, that he was likely to be a brutal dictator. But what could we do about it, right? We weren't in a position to go over there and remove him, so we had to keep an eye on him. And that's exactly what Roosevelt did all throughout his term as president. Now, Roosevelt, because of this, had to walk this fine line. And the fine line was he wanted to prepare the United States for war because he anticipated there was going to be problems with Hitler. But at the same time, he couldn't prepare the United States for war because of these neutrality acts, because of these neutrality bills and laws that had been passed after the initial time that we fought in the First World War. So he was walking this fine line of trying to prepare for war with his hands tied, but at the same time not wanting to look like he was antagonizing anybody so that he would look like a warmonger. So this was a very delicate balance act that Roosevelt was looking to do. And so the way this worked was he gave a speech in 1937 called the Quarantine Speech. He gave that in Chicago, where he believed, he put out the belief that, if there was an aggressor nation, what we should do is quarantine that nation. You don't necessarily have to go in and fight it, but just prevent it from spreading. So this was sort of a way to prevent war without actually becoming involved in it, this idea of quarantining. In November of 38, he issued an executive order that asked the military defense industries to produce 10,000 planes ready for combat per year. So he wanted to build up the American Air Force. Certainly, if there was going to be a war, air superiority was going to be an important thing. In September 1939, he also issued a statement that the United States was a neutral nation. We were not going to get involved in this war on one side or the other. And as he said that, he said, this is our official policy, but I certainly don't believe Americans need to be neutral in their hearts. So in other words, he was saying, we are certainly with England, but we can't get involved because of these neutrality acts. Now you might say, well, why doesn't he just go about, repealing these things? Well, that was really, really difficult to do politically. We had lost, well, not we personally, but there had been 11 million people killed in the First World War. Remember, it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was a ghastly, grisly thing. Men came home maimed. Men came home in pieces. Men died of gas attacks, just like you would exterminate a bug, on the battlefield. This was a horrendous, horrendous type of warfare with things like machine guns and tanks and poison gas, all being really used for the first time. We did not want a repeat of that. So this is why it was difficult for Roosevelt to try to maneuver around those things. In the spring of 1940, as Hitler rolled across Europe, and began this massive arms buildup, what FDR said was that he wanted to raise the number of planes produced from 10,000 a year to 50,000 a year. So we wanted to increase it by 5 times over the course. So what you see here is Roosevelt, again, walking this fine line of preparing for war, but at the same time, trying to stay out of it. In 1940, September 1940, Roosevelt institutes the first peacetime draft. The Nazis had over 5 million people in uniform. We had only a couple 100,000. So Roosevelt begins this peacetime draft. And then, as things really begin to heat up in Europe, Roosevelt begins to sort of try to find ways around these neutrality acts. Now, the Neutrality Act said we couldn't sell weapons to belligerent countries. So if there were nations that were at war, we couldn't become an arms dealer and sell them weapons, according to the Neutrality Acts. However, Roosevelt found a loophole. And the loophole was the law did not say you couldn't lend them material or you couldn't lease them material. It said you couldn't sell them material. So Roosevelt introduces this idea of lend-lease, and he sells it to the American people through an analogy based upon a garden hose. He says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you can stand out in your yard with your garden hose, waiting, for a spark to fly over to your house and catch it on fire, and then you can put the fire out at your house. Or you can lend your neighbor the garden hose and let him put the fire out while it's still at his house. And that's what Roosevelt was looking to do with Lend-Lease. By lending or leasing the British some 50 destroyers, old World War I destroyers, it kept them in the battle against the Nazis. We weren't technically violating the law because we weren't selling these things. And we got some access to naval bases here in the Western Hemisphere in exchange for that. So it was a trade. It wasn't a sale. In a fireside chat, he describes America to be the arsenal of democracy. We're not going to get in this, but we will provide the weapons that Britain needs in order to take care of these things. Now, shortly after the attack at Pearl Harbor, December 1941, let me go back. So then in January of 1941, right, the first month of 1941, President Roosevelt lays out what he calls the 4 freedoms. And he said, we don't want to go to war, but if you ever did have to go to war, there's 4 things that are worth fighting for: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so these, of course, were all things that the Nazis were trouncing all over, along with their allies, the Italians and the Japanese. So what Roosevelt does in January of 1941 is he lays out 4 key principles of what you would fight for if you had to go to war. It's not until 10 months later that Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and we get dragged into the war. So even before we get into the war, the actual shooting part of it, Roosevelt is priming the pump for America. He's getting people to think about, all right, what would we fight for? And if we had to fight, we're going to be producing 50,000 planes per year. And if we had to fight, we've got some new naval bases here on the Pacific or in the Atlantic Ocean from trading with the the British. And if we had to fight, we're going to have goodwill with the British because he creates this thing called the Atlantic Charter with Winston Churchill in 1941, where they say, you know what, the United States and England are going to be pals in this war, and we can't get in it, but we will support you from the standpoint of here's what we want to fight for: no territorial gain, freedom of the seas, the ability to have free trade. These are the sorts of things that we are going on record as supporting. Once the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, FDR gets out there, and of course he says, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. And this attack at Pearl Harbor and that speech galvanizes the American people into wanting to, or having to fight in the Second World War. Unfortunately, it galvanizes us toward Japan, which was the lesser of the threats at that time. Luckily, Hitler declares war on the United States on December 11th, and that is what allows us then to get into the war in Europe as well. Now, in January of 1941, just 2 months, roughly 8 weeks after the attack at Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt calls a meeting to Washington, and he says, anybody that wants to fight against the Nazis, come to Washington. We're going to start an alliance against that. And he calls this alliance the United Nations. So he wants to bring together these nations united against the Nazis, united against the Axis powers. And here is a document that he has drawn up. And what it does basically is it shows a list of the countries that are attending. And there was actually 26. And this is the British Empire. It says, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And listed underneath there are the British colonies: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. These were British colonies, just as we had been before the American Revolution. And when Roosevelt sees these listed out as colonies underneath England, he takes his pencil and he draws these pencil lines, and he puts these countries in place where they should be in alphabetical order. So what Roosevelt's basically saying is, no, we're not going to be fighting for the British Empire. We're going to be fighting for democracies. And that's what we end up doing. Now, he asks Congress for a declaration of war on December 8th, 1941, and they grant that. And then instantly, he creates this alliance with these other 26 countries, and he begins almost a constant dialogue with Churchill and Stalin, the other two of the big three. He pretty much acts as his own Secretary of State, and he actively plans the strategies along with the generals on how to fight this war, even and especially the strategy for the D-Day invasion, which is, of course, the attack against Europe to unroot the Nazis from the domination of Europe at that time. He also pledges himself to defeat Germany first, and to do so with unconditional surrender. Now, this becomes a little bit controversial, this idea of unconditional surrender, because what unconditional surrender does is it will very often make the enemy fight harder and longer, right? Because they know that if they lose, that the victors have got the whole thing on them. If you can surrender with some conditions, all right, we'll surrender, but we want to, hold the land that we have, or, you can't try us for this, or you can't, do that, there's some conditions in this. Then what that does is it creates the end of the war as a negotiation. That is exactly what Roosevelt did not want. He understood that Hitler came to power in large measure because Hitler believed, as many people did, that the end of the First World War was messy. that, on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, when they signed the armistice to end the war, that this was not really a definitive defeat, that Germany kind of gave up because it was being in a war of attrition, and then the Allies came in there and they just twisted, the knife in the back of the Germans with reparations and all those sorts of things. And it was that resentment that Hitler was able to build upon to rise to power with the Nazi Party throughout the late 20s and early 30s, and then, of course, begin the war in 39. So when Roosevelt called for absolute victory, which he called for in the Day of Infamy speech, and unconditional surrender, what he wanted to do was he wanted to completely and totally defeat the Nazis, knock them out, completely knock them out, not leave some still in power or some in an ability to negotiate. No, when we win, you've lost. That's it. It's over, and we will dictate the terms for what follows after that. And in that respect, Roosevelt was sitting at Tehran one time on November 30th, 1943, and he was doodling to himself what he thought the world body should look like. What's the peace going to look like after the war is over? And so he begins to sketch, and he sketches out what we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is actually the sketch for the creation of the United Nations. Now, remember, he starts using the term United Nations in January 1941, these nations united against Hitler. And this idea begins to develop in his mind, and he begins to really think about, wow, you know what? If we could create a world organization at the end of this war, we could maybe prevent a third world war. See, Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, 11 million people killed. He was now Commander-in-Chief during the Second World War, ultimately 60 million people killed. He knew about the development of the atomic bomb. And if the atomic bomb was going to be able to do what the scientists said it was going to be able to do, he understood that if there was ever a third world war, hundreds of millions of people would be killed. So Roosevelt had early on this idea of creating a world organization kind of based upon the League of Nations, but more powerful and more successful. And he wanted this to be the lasting legacy of the World War, was to create a United Nations that would then prevent a third world war. And this is the sketch that he came up with for how to do that. He thought there should be a United Nations, right? All the world governments involved in this. There should be an executive committee of the top, 5 or 6 that can make the decisions and such. And then there would be 4 policemen. And the 4 policemen would be the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and England. And so all the countries of the world would come together. They would discuss their problems. The executive committee would make decisions on that. And if peace were disrupted, the 4 policemen would come in and resume and restore peace. He also believed that there should be an ILO, an International Labor Organization. There should be a food and agriculture organization as well, and there should be a health organization. So the United Nations would have an International Labor Organization, a health organization, and a food and agriculture organization. So the idea was that the United Nations should help find people jobs, keep people healthy, and feed folks. And if you can do that, what you're basically doing is providing freedom from fear, freedom from want. Okay, and he understood that much of the conflict that comes around in the world and occurs in the world is because of a lack of resources, a lack of food, a lack of healthcare. So he envisioned this United Nations as helping to preserve that world peace and helping to preserve the ability of the world to talk about its problems before it began to fight about its problems again. Now, Roosevelt, is the commander-in-chief. He appoints Eisenhower to lead the invasion on D-Day, and that gets the foothold onto the European continent once again for the Allies, and within 1 year of that attack on June 6, 1944, Berlin falls. Hitler first. This is exactly what Roosevelt was looking to do, defeated Hitler, and then once that occurred, everything was focused over on Japan. Now, the Japanese fought viciously and furiously throughout the islands across the Pacific. To the point, you would have battles with 10 to 20,000 Japanese soldiers destroyed and killed, defending small little islands with maybe one little airfield on it. So the United States believed that if they were going to fight that hard to defend small little puny islands, imagine how hard they would fight to preserve the homeland, Japan proper. And so this is what led to the idea that maybe we would need the atomic bomb to show them that we meant business, and to maybe get them to surrender before an actual invasion had to occur on the homeland of Japan. And the estimates were that there would be over 1 million casualties, Allied casualties, if we had to go ahead with that invasion. That invasion never actually had to occur, because after the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, which was actually decided by Harry Truman, because Roosevelt had passed away in April of 1945, and the bombs were used in the summer of 1945. So the decision actually came from Harry Truman, but the momentum, the idea, the plan to do this, as opposed to create an actual invasion force, especially after having just seen what had occurred on those islands out there, and knowing what it was like to have to plan an invasion of Europe. That's when the atomic bomb was really brought into the equation to help end the war. So Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war. He died on April 12th, 1945, and it wasn't until May 8th that Germany surrendered. He was on the doorstep of victory. He saw the victory on the way. It was simply a matter of time, but he didn't live long enough to see it in person. He also did not live long enough to see the creation of the United Nations. He died on April 12th, 1945, as I said, and later that month, in April of 1945, the United Nations met for the first time in San Francisco. It was the first meeting of the United Nations. It was one of the first decisions that Harry Truman made, that the convention, the meeting would go ahead, the conference would go ahead. And this was because he believed, as well as Roosevelt did, that we could not afford to have a third world war. And so the vision of the United Nations really begins with Roosevelt picking up these seeds from this idea of the League of Nations from Woodrow Wilson. And then he articulates the 4 things you would fight for, these 4 freedoms, and those become a pillar of what the United Nations is founded on. And you can say what you like about the United Nations, but there has not been a third world war since the creation of the United Nations. Yes, there's been conflict. Yes, there's been big conflict at times, but not a third world war. And much of what the United Nations does every single day doesn't make the front pages, right? The World Health Organization, the World Food Organization, the educational programs, these are all things that the United Nations does that were envisioned in Roosevelt's vision for what the United Nations would do, but they don't make the paper each and every day. So what Roosevelt did was he prepared the United States for war, at the same time keeping the United States out of war. Once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and we were in the war, he brought together every piece of American manufacturing, every piece of American legislation, every man, woman, and child were brought into the war effort to bring about the absolute victory that he had promised on the Day of Infamy speech on December 8th, 1941. And he saw us through that, and he saw us to victory, passing himself just before the final victory, but nonetheless knowing it was assured and having created this world body of the United Nations. So this was some incredible leadership that set up the world for the way the world operated for the next 80 years in the post-war period. That vision was really created by Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and to a smaller degree, Stalin. Of course, he creates problems initially right out of the gate, with the Cold War and such. But had it not been for the Roosevelt leadership, and if Hitler had taken over the world, imagine where we would be today. So that is our presentation on President Roosevelt and World War II, the greatest generation, the generation that faced down pure evil here on Earth, the Nazis and the atrocities that they perpetrated against the Jews and against all people in Europe, Northern Africa, and with their allies across the world. So we'll open it up to any questions or comments.
If anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat box or the question and answer box. And if you would please, if you are watching this with someone else rather than all alone by yourself, if you could put that in the chat box, it helps us to know how many people attended tonight. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? Snide remarks? It's a lot of leadership to cover in 45 minutes. And certainly there are many avenues you can go down, with the way the war was handled and the way the war was won and the way the war was administered. But what I've tried to do here is give you sort of the overarching, arc of history in terms of what was going on with Roosevelt's leadership.
There is a question someone has here. When did Italy surrender?
When did Italy surrender? That's a great question. Italy surrendered around about 1943 with the late 42, early 43, after what the United States did was, the Allies did was, we began to march across the northern part of Africa with a thing called Operation Torch, and then a thing called Operation Husky. And the idea of this was we were, rather than attack Europe, from head on the way the British wanted to, the United States had this idea of let's attack it from the soft underbelly. So the Italians were barely holding on to Africa. They were the ones that were primarily there. They weren't really able to do it. So the Nazis had to come in, which took a lot of resources to support their Italian allies there. And what we did was marched across Northern Africa with Operation Torch, Operation Husky, and then into Salerno, and then from Salerno up into Italy, all the way on up to Rome. There was still quite a bit of sort of guerrilla fighting going on in the northern part, but once Italy had seen that they were losing the war and they were able to get out from under Mussolini, then they decided, wow, you know what, this was not the thing to do. We need to be on the other side. Let's see, here's a question. How much opposition did Roosevelt face in the U.S. during the war years, and how did he respond to it? He faced a lot of opposition. Americans had no stomach for war after the First World War, because the problem with the First World War, well, there's many problems, but one of them was that it was oversold. It was this idea of the war to end all wars. We go over there, we fight this war, and then what we'll do is we'll wipe out this stuff once and for all, and we'll never have to fight another war. Well, that's not the way it happened. And we were promised that, Europe would be a better place and a cleaner place and a, less messy place politically and militarily at the end of the First World War. And that's not what happened. It was messier than it was before. So we had kind of felt that we had been oversold in what the First World War was supposed to be about. And we said to ourselves, you know what, we're sitting here behind two oceans, Atlantic on one side, Pacific on the other. What are we doing going over there fighting in the first place? So keep in mind also that people had just come out of, or were still coming out of, the Great Depression. So, most folks were still worried about keeping jobs, having jobs, putting food on the table. I don't care what Hitler's doing over there. I got to feed my family. It's probably terrible, and I do kind of care, but my main focus is feeding my family and getting through this Great Depression, which we've been in for 12 years now. So there was a lot of opposition. But what Roosevelt did was he kept his eye on what Hitler was doing while he was also, maintaining things here in the United States. And, he saw piece by piece Hitler marching across Europe. And each time Hitler did something in Europe, Roosevelt countered it here by, creating the 10,000 planes a year, upping it to 50,000, creating the first peacetime draft, giving the Four Freedoms speech, giving the quarantine speech, these sorts of things. So there was a lot of opposition. In fact, the idea of America first, right? So, Trump has kind of, made that popular. America First was a movement here in the United States that said, no, don't sell anything to England. Don't give anything to England. Don't trade anything to England. Keep it here for ourselves so that if it does come down to having to fight that, this war, we're going to have this stuff ourselves. And it was important people like Charles Lindbergh, who was a big leader in that. So there was a lot of opposition to getting into the war. Some folks said it's not our business, it's a European thing. Some folks said it didn't work the first time we went over there, we're not going to go back again. Some folks saw that, we're not prepared for this. We don't have a strong military. We're not in a position to go help anybody. Other folks felt, let's get through this Great Depression before we start, going out and, having wars in other places and such. So there was a lot of opposition. And Roosevelt had to walk that fine line of preparing us for war, but at the same time, keeping us out of it so that if we ended up getting into it, we were in a position where we would be able to, to do something. Now, keep in mind, in the summer of 1942, the Nazis were all across Europe. What they hadn't taken over, they had surrounded. So in effect, they had taken it over. They were in the northern part of Africa. All across the northern part of Africa, and their Japanese allies were all across the Pacific Rim, all the way almost down to Australia. So we had a lot of catching up to do when we got into that war. So lots and lots of opposition. Anybody else? Anything else? Did Kristallnacht have anything to do with FDR deciding to ramp up airplanes in November of 1938? Well, that was a real eye-opener because what that did, for those of you that don't know, Kristallnacht is it's the night of broken glass. And that was the night that the Nazis took great aim at the Jewish population in Germany and burned Jewish businesses, synagogues, arrested people, murdered people, and it was the beginning of a real crackdown against the people, the Jewish people in Europe and under Nazi-controlled areas. And so, whereas Roosevelt had his suspicions, having read Mein Kampf in German and knowing what Hitler had in mind, that was the symbol that it really was happening. It was really going to take place. And so, it was really a ratcheting up of what was going on in Europe. And it did play into Roosevelt's decision to begin to step up war preparations, on our side. It's kind of like, it's like having a skunk, right? So you see a skunk out in the garden, right? And you think, oh, we got to keep an eye on that skunk. That skunk's not so good. And then with the Kristallnacht, that was when the skunk raised his tail and you think, okay, now the skunk is really meaning business. It's really going to cause problems and we really need to do something about it. So that's when you get the garbage can lid and the broom and you send your wife out to get rid of the skunk. That's the way to do that. Anything else? I'm just teasing. I would go out. Any other questions, comments?
Yep, there's one here.
Okay.
How much of the responsibility for the Japanese American internments is FDR?
Excellent question. First off, there's been a change now. It's no longer being called a Japanese American internment. It's being called a Japanese American incarceration. And that is, it may sound like semantics, but what it means is when the Japanese Americans were incarcerated, what it means is they were basically put in jail. They were contained without having a trial, without having formal charges, without having any due process. So it was more than just an internment. It was an incarceration. It was a taking away of their rights. And the way that happened, ultimately, Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, has to burden ultimate responsibility for the Japanese American incarceration. It was based upon an executive order, Executive Order 9066. And what happened was, after the attack at Pearl Harbor, the folks on the West Coast thought, well, gee, there's a lot of Japanese people out here, Japanese Americans. How do we know they're not involved with, what's going on in Japan? And so there was a lot of political pressure from the politicians out there. Earl Warren was one of them, who later becomes the Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Commission. And he was trying to make some political capital out there. So he was ginning up this idea of, hey, we got to do something about these Japanese Americans out here. The military was hammering away at that as well. They had just been caught with their pants down, so to speak, at Pearl Harbor. Remember, this was this huge base. It was thousands of miles away from any danger. They had the radar. They had the shallow harbor. They had it all figured out. And in fact, they had their hats handed to them by the Japanese. So they could not afford another embarrassing thing like that. So the military and the political folks on the West Coast began to pressure Roosevelt to do something. And what Roosevelt did was he created this order, Executive Order 9066, which allowed for the creation of exclusion zones. Okay, so this executive order basically said is you can keep Japanese Americans out of certain areas. Okay, and in Roosevelt's mind, that was going to be ports, airports, railroad crossings, communication centers, ammo dumps, fuel places, those sorts of things. But when the military got the executive order, they said, oh, we can create exclusion zones. And yeah, you can create exclusion zones. So what they did was they created 2 exclusion zones. One was the entire west coast of the United States, and the other was a portion of the southern border. And they rounded up the Japanese Americans and they sent them off to these camps. So Roosevelt never said, oh, get out there and round up all the Japanese Americans. But he did respond to the pressure from the military and from the political folks on the West Coast to allow for this executive order, which was then implemented by the military to round up 120,000 innocent Americans, Japanese Americans. So ultimately, it wasn't like Roosevelt ever gave an order to do it. However, an order that he gave, Executive Order 9066, became the foundation for what the military did. And since he's the boss of the military, ultimately he has responsibility for that as well. So it's kind of a tricky thing, but certainly it was seen as a huge, black eye in the Roosevelt legacy. It was something that should not have occurred. It showed a lack of leadership. It showed a lack of understanding, and it showed, basically the civil liberties of 120,000 Americans being stepped on, in relationship and in reaction to this war. Okay. So yes, that's so he bears responsibility for it, no doubt about it. People question what would have happened after our Civil War had Lincoln lived. Do you have any insight into what would have happened had Roosevelt lived longer? Wow, that's a great, great question. We will never actually know. But I do have some insight into that. And here is, and you've probably heard bits and pieces of this, but one of the big criticisms, the last big conference, there was like 5 wartime conferences, and the last big wartime conference was the conference at Yalta. And Franklin Roosevelt was deathly ill. His blood pressure was through the roof. In fact, he returns from Yalta and he dies 6 weeks later of a stroke. He was not a well man when he went to Yalta, but he needed to go to Yalta because he needed to convince Chairman or Premier Stalin that the United Nations was a good idea, and that it was a good idea for the Soviet Union to be a part of this. Roosevelt knew that, the Soviet Union was the other big superpower coming out of this war. And if we didn't have their cooperation with the United Nations, it wasn't going to work. So what Roosevelt did was he went to Yalta and he, was schmoozing with Stalin and saying, hey, man, we really need your support in this. We really need, come on, we'll make it happen. Come on, just, we agree with this? Come on, we can do this. And Stalin said, all right, in principle, we agree to this. However, the conference was then going to be held in April of 1945, right? A couple months later in San Francisco. And it was at that conference that Roosevelt believed he was going to refine what that meant for the Soviet Union to be involved. So the Soviet Union kind of thought, oh, really? We're going to carve up the world and be like, and Roosevelt's like, no, well, not exactly. What we're going to do is we're going to work together to make things happen. And the Soviets kind of took that as, oh, great. And that's not what Roosevelt intended. Had Roosevelt lived and, had gotten together with Stalin at that United Nations conference in San Francisco, he probably would have, or certainly would have tried to temper Stalin's, grasping at power and territory in the European area, and so perhaps the Iron Curtain would not have fallen, or had fallen so heavily or so thickly had Roosevelt lived. We don't know, we'll never know, but that was the plan, was to soften Stalin's intentions at that conference, but Roosevelt passed away and wasn't able to do that. Let's see here. What about his not acting on the atrocities happening in Poland? Well, that's another of the controversies. Basically, his hands were tied in terms of that. The atrocities that were going on in Poland, would have been impossible to stop had it not been, we didn't have the troops on the ground. We didn't have the ability to really react and respond to that. We had just fought our way across all of Europe, from the English Channel, and so certainly the idea was, let's wrap this war up. Let's get this United Nations under control here. Let's get this thing put together, and then we can begin to talk about these things. We'll create a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We'll get a sense of what's right and wrong in the world, and we will have the structure to prevent these kinds of things from happening. So I'm not going to say he turned his eyes against it, but I'm also not going to say he jumped in and, took it full on. He felt that his hands were tied in his ability to be able to do that, but that once the war was completed and there was a United Nations, there would be a structure to begin to address these things. And the ultimate sellout of Poland. Well, again, that was one of the things that he was going to take up with Stalin, and at the United Nations conference in San Francisco, and clarify the position on all of that, but never had the opportunity to do that. And that is one of the criticisms, that he was too sick to be at Yalta, and that he overpromised Stalin too much, and he shouldn't have done that. Not knowing that he would have the ability to tone that down and to walk that back a little bit. But of course, that's the way it happened. That's the way it worked out. Not a good situation, but that's the situation that did occur. Okay, okie dokie. Anything else, anybody? And you could take entire courses on world leadership, Roosevelt leadership, World War II. What we've tried to do here is just kind of, dance across the overarching, highlights and such. And if you want to learn more, come on down to the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, where we have entire galleries dedicated to the material that I've talked about. And we have 17.5 million pages of documents, a stack that would be 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stack them all on top of each other, that you can come and explore in our research room and learn more about this, on your own. But hopefully I've given you some insight as to the Roosevelt leadership with the war. And again, let's not forget, Veterans Day later this week, okay? A time to really honor these folks who gave so much for this country and are still giving so much and are out there every single day, you know, keeping us safe and, you know, keeping us able to live the freedom and the fun that we're having here back in the States. Okay. Anybody else, Toby, or are we done?
No, it looks like we're done. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. And Jeff, can I just ask quickly, you know that the libraries have museum passes to your location. Are they, for a while, they were
Yeah,
not allowed to be used? Are they now?
we haven't opened. We do have passes at the libraries that folks can check out and come to the museum. We're not honoring them at this time because of the COVID situation. We have to keep very careful track of the number of people that are coming in and out of the building. So we're doing that through advanced sales. Through the website. So as soon as we're back to normal, the passes are up and running again, and you're more than welcome to come on down and take a look around. That's something that we think is very, very important. The work that you guys do at your little local libraries is just so critically important. You know, not only to the fun and frolic of people's lives, because you get access to speakers and books and, you know, movies and things like that and programming, but also to democracy, right? Because it's those little libraries that contain all that information and all that free thinking. And that's what's keeping us, you know, able to maintain this democracy. So as soon as it's over, you guys will be welcome back with open arms.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff.
Okie dokie. And listen, folks, in the meantime, if I don't see you before the holidays, have a safe and happy holiday, whatever it is that you guys, you know, celebrate, and we will see you again down the road.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.